I can recall my elementary school experiences and remember having old torn up textbooks that had been passed on for several years. I remember eating hot lunch that consisted of mystery meat and overcooked vegetables and a carton of milk. I also remember my parents spending a fortune on school supplies for me and my two brothers. I feel like all of these problems resulted in a lack of funding for the education. The U.S. Constitution gives the majority of the responsibility for funding public schools to each individual state. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was passed in 1965, allowed the federal government to help the students fund education. Decades later, No Child Left Behind was enacted, and it created an immense increase in the amount of federal funding given to public schools. Just in the year of 2001, the year that No Child Left Behind was enacted, the amount increased in funding skyrocketed from $42.2 billion to $55.7 billion. However, in 2007, everything began to change. A major cut of $75 billion put many states in a stressful spot. This is when schools started to cut programs such as art, physical education, and music classes. While I was volunteering at a local elementary school in Butte, Montana, a primary teacher, Miss Wareham, informed me that general grade teachers were now required to teach their own music, their own art, and their own physical education classes. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taught at all. Currently, I've spent time at an elementary school here in Fort Collins, Colorado, Coyote Ridge Elementary School, and they have an emphasis on reading and math. If the students are not proficient in these two subjects, then they don't get to have their weekly science or social studies class. Instead, they would be required to spend that class time studying weak areas of reading or math. Since when did science and social studies become put on the back burner? If there was more funding for public schools, students would be receiving a well-rounded education filled with topics of interest. As I spoke earlier of my own elementary experiences, I mentioned several problems that occurred back then, and there has been pretty big progress. Torn up textbooks are now being replaced with new technology such as iPads. Although in some cases, such as a middle school in West Columbia, South Carolina, they are requiring students to purchase their own tablets on the school supply list. My cousin was outraged after she was informed that she needed to buy such an expensive piece of technology for her preteen. Many schools do, however, and they provide their own technology after receiving grants to embrace these new forms of technology. But school supply lists are only becoming more and more extensive. For example, in my local school district, the Poudre School District, in the elementary schools, each grade is required to purchase over 20 different supplies. This is something that should be funded. Many families struggle to buy school supplies for their children, especially families with more than one child. The poor lunches that were served to me back in the day seem to be no more in public schools. Yay! In 2010, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act was enacted. They gave the United States Department of Agriculture the responsibility to make sure that there were nutritional standards that needed to be met in public schools. It also gave more access for low-income families to afford school lunches. It also enforced the school to be aware of these standards that were set and made sure that they followed up with these standards. This is a good move for the government. Students who are hungry or fed poor, nutritious lunches will have a harder time focusing on their schoolwork. Now that I've discussed the lack of funding in the primary setting, I would like to touch on the lack of funding in the post-secondary setting. After spending 4 years in college, I will graduate in December with over $12,000 in debt. Why is college so expensive? Doesn't the government care about having a society filled with educated citizens? I chose one of the cheapest universities around and will still be in an extreme amount of debt following graduation. Imagine how much a graduate will owe after attending an Ivy League school. According to Huffington Post, the average college student who graduated in 2012 will be in approximately $29,400 in debt. It is time for Americans to take a stand and fight for a good, well-rounded education for all students. If we want this country to continue to be successful, we need educated citizens to contribute to the society. With lack of funding for education, we are creating an environment filled with simple-minded, unintelligent people. Thank you.